Hello everybody, this is lesson 4 on intervals. Welcome. And in this video, I want to talk about the different ways to expand and shrink intervals. So think, actually I'll put the word expand on this side here. So expanding, making anything bigger, right? And then contracting or shrinking, making anything smaller. Okay, so let's start with the minor second, because the minor second is the the smallest interval is the perfect unison. The P, you can call it a P1 or PU, the perfect unison or perfect one. That's going to be the smallest, and that's going to have one semitone, and that goes to then the minor second, which has 2 semitones. Now, if I want to expand that, then I go to a major second. Excuse me. And by the way, intervals don't have to expand just from the top. You can take an interval like this. I just played a B. I just played B to C, so I'm playing B. And actually, you guys can hear that I'm not on middle C here, but you can hear B to C. Now, if instead of B to C, I did B to C sharp, would sound like that, and that would now be a major second. But I could go back to that minor second. I'm going to try to erase that. There we go. Go back to that major second, and instead of changing the C to C sharp, what if instead I expanded by turning it into a B flat to C? Now I've got a major second. So it's expanding and contracting is something that can happen either way. Like right now, that's a second. I just wrote a generic second. If I left it like this and I wanted to properly label it, that's a minor second. But if I wanted to expand that and turn B to C, notice I'm not changing the B note or the C note. That's staying the same. But if I want to make it a major second and I want to change so keep the B the same, that's why I'm coloring that in, then I would have to turn that into a C sharp. Okay, what if I took that same B to C, but this time don't modify the C. Keep the C the same to make this a major second. Then I'd have to flat. So just notice that expansion, how you expand, can be at the top or the bottom. And again, I'm doing these intervals melodically, but you could also do them harmonically. I think those sound great. Okay, so major second, and then after the major second comes the minor third. After the minor third comes the major third. And then from there, we get the perfect fourth, and then we get the perfect fifth, and then we get a minor 6, major 6, minor 7, major 7. So that's a nice little clean way to think about like all of these simple intervals just moving through the octave. Now I'm going to actually simplify this a lot, because I kind of just want you to think in qualities. How do we think about contraction and expansion in qualities? So the smallest quality, the smallest possible quality, is the diminished quality. See, I don't even have diminished in one of these intervals. I just used major and minor and perfects. But remember, diminished is even smaller. That's shrinking something even smaller. So it goes diminished, minor, major, and then how do I make major bigger? I can turn major into augmented. Now, you might be thinking, but what about perfect intervals? Perfect intervals are in a category of their own. You cannot make perfect intervals minor. You cannot say a minor fourth or a major fourth. Minor fifth, major fifth is incorrect. That's incorrect on multiple levels. Fifths and fourths and octaves are only perfect, or if you want to shrink them, If you shrink them, they're called diminished fourths, diminished fifths. Or if you want to expand them, they are called augmented fourths, augmented fifths, and so forth. And you might think, do those happen in music? Augmented fifth, augmented fourth? Yes, actually all the time. They're actually quite common. So the augmented and diminished intervals are, it is true that there are some, they're not theoretical intervals, but they're just not as common. But most of these are like, I'm just trying to think what would be not very common. What's not very common is like a diminished unison. That should sound really odd to you, because it is odd. Nobody writes diminished unisons. But even like if you took a third, even if I took a third and I was here on D and then I went to B, like that is just a plain generic third, right? Okay, well, what if I went, right now though, if I just leave it like that, it's not a generic third, sorry guys, that's a minor third. Now, what if I contract it? And I contract it by turning that into a D flat. So now I have D flat down to B. That's no longer a minor third. What could it be? Well, minor, the next step down, is diminished. So I'd have to label that as a diminished third. And now you might be thinking, whoa, a diminished third, isn't that just a whole step? Sure, it is, but notationally, that's a third, that's not a second. Now, I could write the inharmonic equivalent of it, and instead of spelling the D flat, the D as a flat, I could respell that inharmonic equivalent using C sharp, and I can go C sharp to B, and now I would call it a major second. So if this just blew your mind, good. Think about this. They sound the same. That was D flat to B. That was C sharp to B. So these are inharmonic equivalents of each other. Inharmonic equivalence as a property happens all the time. Inharmonic equivalence, I can't talk and write at the same time. These are inharmonic equivalents. So D flat and C sharp, they sound the same, but they are spelled differently, and therefore they are labeled differently. The D, the diminished third versus the major second, they have the same amount of semitones. If you were just going to count semitones, they have the same. But just notice the subtleties here, the subtleties in how it's labeled and how it's notated. And this concept is beyond the scope of this course, but I would use the diminished third. I would use the diminished third in the key of C minor. And if I was using a chromatic chord called the Neapolitan, this is not what we're doing right now. You guys don't have any idea what that is, but it's a 2 chord, it's a flatted 2 major chord. And I would use that diminished third all the time. It sounds so awesome. So if I do this, that's a diminished third, and harmonize like this. That sounds awesome. That is the diminished third. It's in solfege, that would be Ra to T, and I would resolve it to Do after. That's what I did. Now, if I was doing a C sharp to B, so taking the same notes, I can harmonize that differently. Harmonize it as I could harmonize this as Re Do. So Re Do. So that would sound like this, something like, right? That sounds totally different. But I took the same 2 notes and I just, depending on the context, it can just function in multiple ways here. Okay, so now let's talk about, I want to talk about the 4th and the 5th, because these are a little bit trickier. So if I just take this is a perfect 4th as it stands. This is a perfect 4th. Let me just label it here. Now, if I take that perfect 4th and say I want to expand it on the top, then we call that an augmented 4th. I could also, instead of expanding it from the top, I could expand it from the bottom. How would I take C to F and make that bigger with only dealing with the bottom? I'd have to turn that into a C flat, and now I have an augmented fourth that way. Now, is there such thing as a diminished fourth? Yes, I could write C to F flat, but I will say that the diminished fourth, this doesn't really happen. I mean, maybe on rare occasions, but this is just one of those intervals that I do not see. I cannot even think of one musical example where I have seen a diminished fourth. Is it possible there's a diminished fourth out there? Yes, of course. Anything is possible. But I just haven't seen, in all the music I've played, in all the decades I've played music, I can't think of any diminished fourths. Okay, so now let's talk about the fifth. And I'll just start on F. F to C is a perfect fifth. And I just know my perfect intervals because I have the circle of fifths. I just have that, it's burned into my brain. I just know it really, really well. Now, if I take that perfect fifth and say I want to shrink that fifth, okay. So if I want to shrink the fifth, if I'm starting on the perfect and I want to shrink it, contract it, I'll go to a diminished fifth. So to make that into a diminished fifth is very easy. I could flat the top, C, or I could take that same fifth and I could instead raise the bottom. So I could do that. So perfect fifth sounds like this. Diminished fifth sounds like that. Other diminished fifth. This is also a diminished fifth, but it's just spelled as F sharp, C natural. The first one was F and C flat. Now, they're in the augmented fourth and the diminished fifth, both of these. There are 6 semitones in both of them. These are actually inversionally the same. So when we talked about interval inversion, remember we talked about like the major second inverts to a major seventh because 2 plus 7 equals 9, and then it's the opposite in quality, right? Well, the same thing happens with perfect intervals. If I start with a perfect interval and if I flip a perfect fourth, I'm going to end up with a perfect fifth, like that. That's how the perfect intervals work. They actually, the quality of perfect stays the same. If I start with a perfect fifth and I invert it, I get a perfect fourth. So those I think are pretty easy. Now, if I start with a diminished fifth and I invert it, I'm going to end up with an augmented fourth. It adds up to 9, 5 plus 4 is 9, and then you have the opposite in quality. If I start off with an augmented fourth, then I'm going to come up with a diminished fifth. So you can see how that works. If I take this diminished third, and I want to invert it, that becomes an augmented sixth. So 3 plus 6 equals 9, and then it's the opposite in qualities. So I hope that makes sense. By the way, the augmented sixth, this happens in music all the time. We start to learn those a little bit later on. I'd be really happy if you can get the basic intervals, which are mostly major and minor, and perfect, diminished, augmented. The last thing that I'm going to say in this video here, oh, I just lost my train of thought here. Oh, now I remember what I was going to say. Okay, so the diminished fifth and augmented fourth, and I was going to say vice versa, but it's really the same thing. If you have 6 semitones, this particular interval has another name for it, an additional name, and that is called the tritone. And back in, I would say like 1,000 years ago, instead of the whole step, we think of whole steps and whole tones. The word tone actually stood for whole step. Okay, think of tone as a whole step. Okay, so if you think of tritone, that's 3 whole steps. 3 whole steps, that's what gives you a tritone. So if I start at C and I go whole step, and then whole step would have to take me here to this F sharp, that is a tritone. And tritones are super unstable and super active. But you start anywhere, and if you count up to, I'll start on A. If I go whole, 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 actually let me try that again. If I go A to B, that's a whole. B to C, that's, I can't do that. That's a half step. So another whole would take me here. And then here, I can't go to D, that's a half step. So I have to go to here. So I'm going A to E flat or A to D sharp, however I spell it. No matter how I spell it, it's still considered a tritone. So tritones are extremely important in music. The main tritone that you guys need to know is there's a tritone between Fa and T. That's what you need to know. You need to know this one tritone, and the tritone is really what makes the major scale, it's why the scale degrees function the way they do. It's why T is so active, Fa is so active. The tritone, this interval, also has something to do with it. Now I'm going to say one more thing, one more thing about the major scale. This is a property of the major scale that I think is very, very cool. The major scale includes every possible interval. So if you didn't know that, now you know it. All of the possible intervals. I gotta say, like with the exception of the augmented intervals, I'm really talking about major minor intervals. I'm really talking about the tritone. All of the intervals you can find within the major scale. That's what makes it so incredibly unique. So there you go. That is your lesson on how to expand and contract intervals, and also how to do this with perfect intervals, which is just a little bit different. Remember that fourths, unisons, fourths, fifths, and octaves only can be these three qualities. They can only be perfect, or if they're shrunk, diminished. If they're expanded, then augmented, but they can never be major or minor. So just try to remember that in regards to the unison, fourth, fifth,